Arab billionaire asks his sexy African maid to play the piano to humiliate her, but when she starts, everyone bows before her. You won't believe what happened next. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. The chandelier's golden glow illuminated the extravagant hall of Khaled al-Fayez's estate, where the most powerful businessmen and aristocrats of the Middle East gathered for an exclusive evening. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey as conversations filled the room with quiet arrogance. Khaled, a man of untouchable power and wealth, sat at the head of the long dining table, his piercing dark eyes surveying his guests with satisfaction. Tonight was another celebration of his success, a reminder to everyone in the room that he was at the top. Among the elegantly dressed guests, one person stood out, but not for her wealth. Amina, the African maid, moved silently through the room, refilling glasses and adjusting silverware with a poise that seemed misplaced in her uniform. She was beautiful, too beautiful, Khaled thought. She had deep brown skin that glowed under the golden lights, full lips that never spoke unless spoken to, and dark, intelligent eyes that held an untamed fire. It irritated him. She was just a servant, yet there was something about the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence in her every movement, that made him uncomfortable. Khaled leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of whiskey. A smirk formed on his lips. He would put her in her place. Raising his voice just enough for the entire room to hear, he said, "Amina, do you play the piano?" The room quieted. The guests, always eager for entertainment, turned their eyes toward the maid. Amina hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding. "Yes, sir, a little." Khaled chuckled, feigning amusement. "A little? How modest. Come then, entertain us." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd as Khaled gestured toward the grand piano at the far end of the room. It was a magnificent instrument, polished to perfection, a symbol of sophistication that few could master. Amina hesitated, gripping the tray in her hands. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, judging, expecting her to fail. She was well aware of what this was, a test, a humiliation disguised as an invitation. For a second, she considered refusing. But then, something in her chest hardened. She would not give him the satisfaction of fear. Placing the tray down with grace, she walked across the room. Her steps were measured, steady, despite the pounding of her heart. The guests whispered among themselves as she sat before the piano. Some snickered. A servant playing the grand piano. Ridiculous. Khaled crossed his arms, watching her with an amused smirk. He was ready to laugh. Amina placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes. And then she played. The first notes were delicate, flowing like a whispered secret into the room. Then came the melody, rich, deep, and hauntingly beautiful. Conversations died. Laughter faded. The sound that filled the hall was not just music. It was a force. It commanded attention, weaving emotions through the air like a spell. The guests, who had expected to be entertained by her failure, found themselves captivated instead. Khaled's smirk disappeared. His chest tightened. This was no simple playing. This was mastery. Raw, undeniable genius. Amina's fingers danced across the keys with a grace so effortless that it seemed impossible. The song was a storm of passion, bold, breathtaking, and defiant. She was not playing for them. She was playing for herself. By the time the last note echoed into silence, the room was no longer the same. A heavy stillness hung in the air, thick with awe. Then, without a word, one guest stood, then another, and another. One by one, the most powerful men in the room rose to their feet, not in mockery, but in silent reverence. Even Khaled, despite himself, felt his body betray him as he slowly stood up. Amina lifted her hands from the keys, breathing softly, her gaze meeting Khaled's with quiet defiance. She had not only passed his test, she had conquered it. Khaled remained standing, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He had planned to humiliate her, to remind everyone in the room of the natural order, where men like him ruled and women like her served. But now, the weight of his own arrogance pressed against his chest. He had expected laughter, maybe a few mocking claps, but instead they had bowed to her. The silence in the room stretched, thick with something unspoken. The guests, men who had spent their lives believing wealth and power determined worth, had been forced into a moment of truth. They had witnessed something that transcended status, something undeniable. Amina stood from the piano bench with slow grace, her dark eyes meeting Khaled's without fear. If he had wanted to break her, he had only given her a stage to shine. A cough broke the silence, then a murmur. The spell was breaking, and Khaled needed to act, fast. He clapped, once, twice. A slow, deliberate sound that carried authority. The guests, unsure of what to do, followed his lead. Applause rippled through the room, though some men exchanged uneasy glances, as if afraid they had just witnessed something dangerous. Khaled forced a smirk, tilting his head as he studied Amina. "Impressive," he drawled, though there was an edge to his voice. He would not let her walk away victorious so easily. "Tell me, where did you learn to play like that?" Amina's expression remained unreadable, but her voice was steady. "My father was a musician. He taught me." Khaled raised a brow. "A musician? And now you serve drinks in my house. How ironic." A few of the guests chuckled, an attempt to restore the balance of power. But Amina did not lower her gaze. Instead, she let the insult hang between them, refusing to let it touch her. "I play because I love music," she said simply. "Not because of where I stand in this room." A flicker of something, anger, respect, crossed Khaled's face. This woman did not behave like a servant. She did not shrink under his scrutiny. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, eyes locked onto hers. "Then perhaps you are in the wrong profession." It was not a compliment. It was a test. The room waited, tension thick enough to cut. Amina did not hesitate. "Perhaps, sir," she said smoothly, tilting her head ever so slightly. "Or perhaps I am exactly where I need to be." The response was bold, too bold. A whisper of amusement flickered in the eyes of a few guests. They were entertained now, but Khaled was not. He could not let her win. Khaled exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down with a soft clink. He turned to the crowd. "Enough distractions. Gentlemen, let us return to our real business." The guests, eager to move past the uncomfortable shift in power, murmured in agreement. The tension eased as conversations resumed, and the evening drifted back to its expected rhythm. But Khaled was not finished with Amina. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Stay." Amina hesitated, then slowly turned back to face him. He studied her, his smirk returning, but this time it held something different. Curiosity. Challenge. You intrigue me, he admitted, swirling the liquid in his glass. A servant who plays like a master. I wonder, what else are you hiding? Amina met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Nothing, sir. I only play the piano. Khaled chuckled. I doubt that. He leaned forward slightly. And I don't like mysteries in my house. Amina remained still, waiting. He exhaled, then waved a hand. Go, for now. She gave a small nod and turned, walking away with the same quiet dignity that had unsettled him from the beginning. As she disappeared through the servants' entrance, Khaled found himself gripping the edge of the table, deep in thought. He had tried to put her in her place. Instead, she had put him in his. Khaled couldn't shake the unease that settled in his chest. The sound of Amina's piano playing still echoed in his mind, each note a defiant reminder of something he didn't understand or refused to accept. He was a man who controlled everything in his world. Yet, in a single moment, a mere maid had shifted the air in his own home, turning the eyes of his most powerful guests away from him and onto her. This wasn't something he could ignore. The party had ended hours ago, but Khaled remained in the grand hall, standing near the piano. His fingers traced the smooth, polished surface, his mind replaying the look in her eyes, the quiet defiance, the unshaken confidence. Who was she? He had never paid much attention to his household staff. They came and went, serving their purpose, never daring to step beyond the boundaries of their roles. But Amina had crossed that line, not with rebellion, but with sheer talent. A talent that didn't belong in the hands of a servant. With a deep breath, he turned sharply and strode toward the servants' quarters. His steps were measured, controlled, yet each one carried an unspoken urgency. He needed answers. Reaching the corridor where the maid slept, he paused outside Amina's door. A small brass nameplate bore her name, one he had barely noticed before tonight. Without knocking, he pushed the door open. Amina was inside, sitting on the edge of her modest bed, her fingers lightly rubbing together as if she were still feeling the piano keys beneath them. The dim lamp cast a warm glow on her dark skin, highlighting the delicate features that had drawn the attention of so many men that evening. She didn't look surprised to see him. "Couldn't sleep, sir?" she asked softly, her voice calm. Khaled's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way by a servant, without fear, without unnecessary politeness. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "You should have told me." Amina tilted her head slightly. "Told you what?" "That you could play like that," he said, his voice colder than he intended. "I don't like surprises in my own house." Amina let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "And what would you have done, sir? Given me a stage? Or would you have sent me away before tonight could happen?" Khaled's eyes narrowed. She wasn't wrong. If he had known she was capable of something that could make men bow in admiration, he would have never allowed her to be in that room. Amina continued, her tone unreadable. "You didn't ask me if I could play. You only asked when you thought it would humiliate me." The words landed like a slap, sharp, honest, undeniable. Khaled clenched his fists at his sides. He hated this feeling, this uncomfortable, unshakable sense that he had miscalculated. He stepped closer, his presence towering over her. "You speak boldly for a servant." Amina lifted her gaze to meet his, unflinching. "Because I know who I am, sir. Do you?" A strange tension filled the space between them, not anger, not fear, something else entirely. For the first time in years, Khaled felt unsettled, as if he were the one under scrutiny. She had turned the game against him. He exhaled, forcing himself to regain control. "You will play again," he said, his voice a command. "Tomorrow night, in front of my most important investors." Amina studied him for a moment, then slowly shook her head. "No." Khaled blinked, the word almost foreign to him. No. No one told him no. He stepped forward, his patience thinning. "You work in my house, under my roof. You will do as I say." Amina met his gaze, calm but unwavering. "I was hired to serve, not to perform." A slow smirk pulled at Khaled's lips, though his amusement didn't reach his eyes. "You think you have a choice?" Amina held his stare for a long moment, before she stood, her movements deliberate, measured. She was shorter than him, yet somehow, in that moment, she felt just as powerful. She took a step closer, tilting her chin up ever so slightly. "And you think you can force me?" Khaled exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had never met a woman who spoke to him this way. Every word, every glance, was a challenge. A game she was playing without fear. A muscle in his jaw ticked as he considered his next move. For the first time in years, he was at a loss for words. Amina gave him a small, knowing smile. Then, as if dismissing him entirely, she turned away and sat back down on her bed. Khaled stayed there, staring at her, the weight of the night pressing against his chest. She had just done the impossible. She had told Khaled Al-Fayez no, and walked away untouched. Khaled left Amina's room in silence, but his mind was anything but quiet. The moment he stepped back into the dimly lit corridor, he exhaled sharply, as if trying to shake off the control she had somehow taken from him. No one, not a single person in his entire life, had ever looked him in the eye and told him no. Yet Amina had. And worse, she had walked away from it, untouched, unpunished, undefeated. He wasn't sure what irritated him more, the fact that she had refused him, or the fact that he had let her. Back in his private suite, Khaled poured himself a drink and sat by the open balcony, staring at the vast city skyline. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to temper the heat simmering beneath his skin. Amina's music, her defiance, the way she held herself with such effortless confidence, it all gnawed at him. Why did she have that talent, that presence, that power? And why did he feel as if he had lost a battle he didn't even realize he was fighting? A quiet knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His butler, Rafiq, entered, his expression unreadable as always. "Sir, the investors are expecting a performance tomorrow. Should I make arrangements for a professional pianist?" Khaled clenched his jaw, gripping the crystal glass in his hand. He could have any pianist in the world perform. He could bring in a legend, someone trained in the finest halls of Europe. But no matter how much money he threw at the problem, none of them would silence the memory of Amina's music. He had made a mistake that night, not in asking her to play, but in underestimating what would happen when she did. "Forget the pianist," Khaled said after a long pause. "Amina will play." Rafiq hesitated for the first time. "Sir, she has already refused." Khaled's lips curled into a smirk. "Then I will give her a reason to change her mind." The following morning, Amina moved through the halls of the estate, carrying a tray of tea toward the garden. It was routine by now, knowing her place, performing her duties with silent efficiency. Yet, everything felt different today. The night before, she had challenged Khaled and walked away with her dignity intact. Most men in his position would have punished her immediately, dismissed her, humiliated her, ensured she learned her place. But he hadn't, and that disturbed her more than anything. She had seen something flicker in his eyes last night, something beyond anger. It was curiosity, frustration, something darker, as if her defiance had awakened something in him he couldn't control. She wouldn't give it more thought. Men like him thrived on control, and she had no intention of playing his game. But Khaled was not a man who allowed loose ends. As she stepped onto the stone path leading to the garden, she found him waiting for her, sitting at an outdoor table beneath the shade of a towering palm tree. He was dressed in an impeccable tailored suit, his presence as commanding as ever. "Sit," he said, not looking up from his coffee. Amina hesitated. She wasn't required to sit with him, this wasn't normal, but refusing in front of the other staff would create a scene, something she wanted to avoid. So, with quiet dignity, she set the tray down and lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Khaled finally looked at her, his gaze sharp, assessing. "I want you to play at tonight's gathering." Amina remained composed. "I already told you no." A slow smirk touched his lips. "And yet, here you are, sitting at my table. Everything has a price, Amina. Tell me yours." She exhaled softly, looking away. "You don't understand, do you?" Khaled tilted his head slightly. "Enlighten me." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Music is not something I sell. It is not a transaction." Something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. He was used to people bending for power, for money, but she was not for sale. Khaled leaned back in his chair, watching her with a mixture of amusement and irritation. "Fine, then consider it an obligation. You work in my house, under my rules." Amina let out a quiet laugh. "You don't give orders about what I do outside of my duties, sir. And playing the piano was never one of them." His smirk faded. She was right. Again. For a man who always won, he was losing every time he spoke to her. But Khaled Al-Fayez didn't lose. Not in business, not in power, not in anything. And he certainly wouldn't lose to a maid. "Very well," he said, his voice smooth. "Since you refuse to play, perhaps I should rethink your position in this household altogether." Amina stiffened slightly, but she held his gaze. He was testing her, searching for any sign of fear, of weakness. She gave him none. "If that is what you wish, sir," she said, her tone steady, "then I will leave." Khaled hadn't expected that. He had expected bargaining, resistance, a plea. Instead, she was ready to walk away from his wealth, his power, his threats, without hesitation. For the first time in his life, Khaled felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Was it fear? Not fear of losing control, but fear of losing her. She stood from the table, nodding politely. "If that is all, sir, I have work to do." And just like that, she walked away again. And for the second time, Khaled let her go. Khaled sat motionless as he watched Amina walk away. There was something infuriating about the way she carried herself, not in defiance, not in arrogance, but in absolute certainty of her worth. She didn't beg, She didn't try to argue or plead for his approval. She simply left, as if she owed him nothing. It was a foreign feeling to Khaled, this sense of powerlessness. He clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply. No, he was not powerless. He was Khaled al-Fayez, a man who had built an empire, who had made and destroyed fortunes with a single decision. If he wanted something, he got it. And right now, he wanted Amina to play that piano. More than that, he wanted to understand why she unsettled him so much. Later that evening, the estate was alive with activity once more. The elite of the business world gathered in his grand hall, sipping champagne, exchanging deals masked as casual conversation. It was another night of wealth, power, and superficial pleasantries, everything Khaled had mastered. But tonight, his mind wasn't on the business at hand. His thoughts were on her. She wasn't present. He had noticed the moment he stepped into the hall. Usually, the servants moved discreetly around the guests, refilling drinks, adjusting silverware, ensuring everything was perfect. But Amina was missing. His jaw tightened. She had meant what she said. She wouldn't play. A strange frustration curled in his chest. She was just a maid. Why did it bother him so much that she was resisting him? His investors gathered near the grand piano, waiting for the promised performance. One of them, an older man with graying hair and sharp eyes, turned to Khaled expectantly. "Where is this pianist you spoke of?" Khaled forced a smile. "She will be here." Would she? Doubt crept into his mind for the first time. Had he finally met someone he couldn't control? Just as he was about to send someone to fetch her, she walked in. Amina entered the hall with quiet grace, dressed in the same simple uniform, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. Conversations lulled as eyes turned toward her. Khaled straightened, watching her approach. She was unreadable as ever, but there was something different in her expression tonight. A quiet decision had been made. She stopped a few steps away from him. "I will play." A slow smirk tugged at Khaled's lips. "Have you finally changed your mind?" Amina met his gaze, unshaken. "No. I am doing this for myself, not for you." Khaled's smirk faded slightly. She was unpredictable, always moving in ways he couldn't anticipate. He should have been annoyed, but instead he felt something dangerously close to admiration. Without another word, Amina walked past him, toward the piano. The room fell silent once more as she sat, her hands hovering over the keys. Then she played. It was different from the night before. This wasn't just music, it was a declaration. A storm of emotion surged through the notes, commanding the room, demanding to be felt. The melody was bold, fierce, unapologetic. Every man in the room, men who built empires, who thrived on power, listened in absolute silence. Khaled felt something stir deep inside him, something unsettling. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was dismantling the walls he had built around himself. By the time the final note faded into silence, there was no hesitation. Every single guest in the room stood, applauding. Even the investor, who had doubted her, wiped his eyes before clapping. "That," he murmured, "was something extraordinary." Khaled remained still, his hands resting against the arms of his chair. Amina stood from the piano bench, offering a polite nod before turning to leave. She didn't wait for approval, didn't expect praise, but just as she reached the exit, Khaled spoke. "Amina." She paused. The entire room watched in anticipation. Khaled's voice was lower now, quieter. "Come work for me." A murmur rippled through the guests. confusion, curiosity. Amina slowly turned back, her expression unreadable. "I already work for you." Khaled shook his head. "Not as a servant." A hush fell over the room. Khaled rose from his seat, stepping closer. "You don't belong in the shadows, serving drinks. You belong on a stage, commanding the world." His voice was steady, controlled, but there was something deeper in it. Something real. Amina studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she said, "I will think about it." And with that, she turned and walked away, again. Khaled exhaled, watching her disappear through the doors. For the third time, he had let her go. And for the first time, he hoped she would return. Khaled barely spoke for the rest of the evening. The usual negotiations, the discussions of power and wealth, all became background noise as his mind remained fixed on her. Amina had done it again. She had entered the room on her own terms, played on her own terms, and walked away without looking back. She had refused to be owned, even by a man who owned everything. His guests had been stunned. Some had questioned his offer. Why would Khaled al-Fayez, one of the most ruthless and successful men in the Middle East, offer a mere maid a position outside of servitude? Others had congratulated him, saying it was a bold investment. But none of them truly understood. It was not about business. He wanted to know what it was about, why this woman lingered in his mind like an unfinished story. But Amina had left him with nothing but silence. The next morning, Khaled sat in his private office, staring at the untouched papers on his desk. His morning meetings had been pushed aside. His schedule, normally precise and unyielding, had been deliberately emptied. He was waiting. Minutes stretched into an hour, then another. Would she come? Would she walk through those doors and say yes? Or had she meant what she said, that she would think about it? Khaled exhaled sharply, irritated by his own impatience. He was not a man who waited. Deals, people, fortunes, they all came to him. Yet here he was, waiting for a woman who had no reason to want anything from him. Just as he was about to stand, a soft knock came at the door. His body tensed. "Enter." The door opened, and there she was. Amina stepped inside, moving with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled him since the beginning. She was still in her uniform, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Khaled leaned back in his chair, studying her. She had come. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she said, "You wanted to see me." Khaled motioned for her to sit. She didn't move. His lips twitched in amusement. "Still refusing to follow orders, I see." Amina arched a brow. "I don't take orders that aren't part of my job, sir." Khaled's smirk faded slightly. "Then let me make you an offer that changes that." Amina remained still, waiting. He exhaled, fingers tapping against the desk. "Work for me, not as a maid, but as a musician. I will arrange for you to train, to perform, to become what you were meant to be." Amina watched him carefully. "And in return?" Khaled held her gaze. "Loyalty." She tilted her head slightly, a slow smile forming. "Loyalty?" "To me," Khaled said, his voice even. "To this house. To the opportunities I am giving you." Amina was silent for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. "So that's what this is." Khaled's jaw tightened. "And what do you think this is?" She stepped closer, placing her hands lightly on the desk between them. Her dark eyes burned into his. "You don't offer things freely, Khaled al-Fayez. Everything has a price." He leaned forward, matching her gaze. "And are you afraid to pay it?" Amina's smile didn't fade. "No, but I need to know what you really want from me." The room was too quiet, the air too thick. For the first time, Khaled couldn't answer. What did he want? He could say it was about control, about ensuring that she remained in his world, where he could understand her, predict her. He could say it was about power, about proving that no one could walk away from him without consequences. But none of that felt like the truth anymore. Finally, he exhaled, standing from his chair. "I want you to say yes." Amina studied him for a long moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "I'll stay." Something in Khaled's chest eased, but just as quickly something else tightened. Because she had agreed. And now, everything was about to change. Khaled should have felt victorious. Amina had agreed. She was staying. He had secured what he wanted. Her presence, her talent, her loyalty. Yet, as she stood before him, composed, unreadable, untouched by his power, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't won at all. She wasn't here because of him. She was here because she had chosen to be, and somehow that made all the difference. The next evening, the grand hall was prepared for another gathering. This time, it wasn't a celebration of business deals or wealth. It was for her. Amina stood at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, as the most powerful men in the city waited. Khaled watched from his place, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. She played. The first note struck the air like a heartbeat, raw and undeniable. The melody built, fierce yet elegant, demanding attention, forcing every soul in the room to feel. And Khaled? For the first time in his life, he was the one being humbled. After the performance, the applause was thunderous. Investors murmured praises, voices filled with awe. "Amina?" She simply smiled, nodded, and walked away. Not toward Khaled, not toward anyone, because she belonged to no one. And Khaled? He realized he had made the biggest mistake of all. He wanted her to belong to him. Khaled sat in his private lounge, drink untouched, mind restless. Amina's music had changed everything. She was no longer just a servant in his house. She was the soul of it. And the worst part? She didn't even realize the power she had over him. That realization unsettled him more than anything. Amina came to him that night, not as a servant, not as a musician, as a woman who made her own choices. "I will leave one day," she said softly. "You know that, don't you?" Khaled looked at her, something foreign tightening in his chest. "Yes," he admitted. But for the first time in his life, he wished he could stop time.